So I remember when I was a fresh 18-year-old girl, just getting into my health and fitness. Stay with me, we're going somewhere with this. So I think back to then. Women were still predominantly told that if they looked at a dumbbell for too long, they'd just magically become the next Arnie. Carbs weren't the devil yet because we hadn't stopped demonizing fat yet. But the long story short is that the pendulum of opinion was doing this. It was going wild, and the public was quite interested with what was going on there, but they were also very, very confused. Most people knew what the right buzzwords were, but it was a landscape of chaotic and polarizing messaging, which thankfully at the time couldn't be supercharged by our friends that are on the floor. You can probably see where we're going with this now. So when I think about that space 20 years ago, it feels very familiar. It's not that different to what's happening in the realm of coaching and positive psychology right now. The general population has access to all of the right lingo, boundaries, gaslighting, trauma, just to name some of the most popular buzzwords right now. Everyone is lapping up all of the information about this, which is really, really important, except that often these concepts get misrepresented and sensationalized, sometimes for the purposes of financial gain on behalf of the content creator, but more often simply because this area is still in its infancy and schools of thought take time to develop and to mature. Even when it's headed in the right direction, the early stages of change are usually messy. People have become very interested in this space, particularly over the last few years, where that incredible perfect storm of COVID-19, recessions, cost of living crisis, global mental health crisis all have converged. And at times, therapists and counselors have booked out for months on end, meaning that the public needed to turn elsewhere for support. So, the population is curious. The population is confused. There is an awareness now that the lack of mental illness does not necessarily equal mental wellness. But literacy in this space is in its infancy, rendering the general public quite vulnerable to the whims of content creators. Now, in the age of social media, anyone can throw in their 2 cents worth, which becomes risky. Some will be okay with creating wildly inaccurate clickbait to go viral, but others might simply get too excited and prematurely go on a public rant before they've properly understood a concept themselves. These situations and others lead to droves of unhelpful information. So we're entering a very unusual time when no longer so concerned with this potential detriment of the overabundance of information, because now the greater concern is that humans are forming almost unbreakable and intimate bonds with the devices themselves. If you're breaking into a little bit of a sweat by now, don't worry, I can see them. They're still there. You don't need to check them. So, I'm not sure if anyone heard this talk, but in her keynote address at the South by Southwest Convention, actually in Sydney, last year, Esther Perel drew an adjacent parallel between physical and mental well-being, and that got me thinking about all of this. She mentioned that in the same way that some years ago we had, as a society, been largely soothing ourselves with junk food until the health and wellness information caught up, which started to help society start to move away from that. Nowadays, we're entering a time where humanity, by and large, soothes itself with its devices. She went on to elaborate how our technological conveniences are moving us into a time where we are so fixated with optimizing everything that it is rendering us intolerant to the chaos of everyday human experiences. The more that we have apps to smooth out the inconveniences of day-to-day life, the less opportunity that we have to practice riding these natural highs and lows ourselves. Anything that we rehearse less, we eventually become rusty and less skilled at. Then, if we just keep slapping on another app and another app and another app to avoid bridging that uncomfortable gap ourselves, we start losing the capacity to manage the emotions that come with the discomfort of things not always going our way, such as turning a page at the time that you want to. People are not always available. Skills take time and sometimes enormous sacrifice to build up. Sometimes we will experience failures and loss, And all of this is not only normal, but it is healthy. This is how we learn about ourselves. This is how we experience and learn to problem solve, to get curious, to get resourceful, and to get inventive. If we shy away from the possibility of feeling anything uncomfortable, to a very large degree, we fail to meet ourselves. So, who am I? One of the greatest questions that has plagued humanity for as long as we have existed. It can feel like a noble pursuit to seek an answer to this, and it might be, but it's also treading into dangerous territory, because as tantalizing as having the answer to this may seem, this is also kind of the epitome of the "I'll be happy when" trap. It's the pursuit of the comfort of unwavering certainty in a constantly changing and chaotic universe. Demonstrating that this question has been around for a long time, you can quite easily find ancient wisdoms that speak to this pursuit. Buddhism meditates upon the impermanence of things, and it somewhat deflects this concept of I, as we are just a part of the cosmos. Hinduism understands every living being to be an embodiment of divinity, but every person is also inseparable from the rest of the divine. An identification purely of body and mind is seen as spiritual ignorance that is ego-driven. So there's wisdom here. But how can we translate this into words that speak more to Western modernity? Ultimately, identity is merely a social construct and only has to be rigid and unyielding if we want it to be. You are always capable of choosing between something that you are versus something that you just do or have. You will not define yourself in the same way that the people in your life define you. And every single person in your life will define you slightly differently to each other. This alone already suggests that identity is just something that we invent and that it is quite fluid and contextual. Clients come to me for change, and my ears immediately prick up whenever I hear, it's just in my personality to do this, or this is just who I am, because ultimately those are choices. Now, it absolutely can be true that you might not yet know another way to respond, how to guide yourself to a different response, or that an alternative response is even available to you. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn. So if you're not careful, getting too protective about your identity can ironically become an obstacle to progress and to growth. In his 40 lessons for his 40th birthday YouTube video, bit of a mouthful, Mark Manson said something very interesting about identity that I wanted to share with you. And I quote, "Be careful how you define yourself. Your identity is a self-constructed mental prison, confining you to a life of desperately seeking and finding things to validate whatever you've chosen to become. Define yourself as loosely and ambiguously as possible. You'll feel less defensive towards the world and be willing to change when it's necessary." End quote. This echoes a wise warning about confirmation bias and about cognitive dissonance. Whenever we hold a belief, from that moment on, we will view the world through a distorted lens that is preferentially searching for evidence that is congruent with that developing belief. When we come across two conflicting ideas, our brain doesn't like this, and it will work very hard to try to remove this discomfort by reconciling this dilemma. If we arrive at cognitive dissonance with a pre-existing belief that one of these thoughts might be more likely to be true, that one will almost invariably win. Over time, this makes this makes belief progressively harder to challenge, which for fluid concepts such as identity, there it is, can be very dangerous and create the perfect storm for a crisis down the line. Left to run on default, our identity usually develops as a collection of beliefs, preferences, relationships, and behaviors that we feel the most strongly about. Our identity is therefore always somewhat in flux because we're making new decisions about all of these things every single day. However, these shifts are usually slight and gradual and in the periphery, so we might not really notice them. I call these identity updates. Sometimes, though, confirmation bias cannot put us into this lull of blissful unawareness. A new event or piece of information comes into an irreconcilable argument with who we believe that we are at that point in time. And then cognitive dissonance reigns, our minds scream, we're thrown into the less peaceful form of identity update, an identity crisis. So this is usually where I will meet somebody. At its most fundamental, coaching is about conversations that guide towards self-discovery and reconnection, and which helps someone move forward into the future with specific actionable steps. While all of that sounds super neat and packageable though, early in the start of the conversation of coaching, it usually feels a little bit more like a tangle of thoughts that are all kind of yelling at each other, and I'm seeing a nod. So particularly if there's a solid identity crisis, it's not going to be pretty in those early stages, just because the end product might be. That's not how it begins. There's often a lot of discomfort, and sometimes a struggle to precisely articulate what is occurring. It can be lonely, it can be confusing, and it can be a really scary time. Some crises begin in our external world. You might need to relocate, you might lose your job, you might start a relationship, you might end a relationship. But some crises originate internally. You might wake up one day and realize, I don't care so much about the things that I thought I cared about. Or, another common one, I'm not going to live my life according to what others demand of me anymore. Questions like this can then take us further into questions like, who am I becoming? Who was I before? Am I still the same person? Am I okay existing like this? And down the rabbit hole we go. So, all of these dilemmas and many others have been around for as long as humans have existed. But this is a particularly interesting time in history where everything is so fast, accessible, and convenient, and we're somewhat compelled to behave accordingly. We are mammals that are attempting to behave like machines, and we are recruiting machines extensively and increasingly to help us go further with this endeavor. But what is all of that for? So many people are burnt out. Excuse me. So many people are overwhelmed. So many people are lonely, and so many of those lonely people feel incapacitated and unable to reach out or be available for other people. The tech and convenience do have many benefits. That's not in question here. But is intelligence and all of its inventions all that it's cracked up to be? Is intelligence possibly something a little bit compulsive and destructive as a drive? As a society, we already know a thing or two about how all of these super clever tech advances are negatively impacting our mental health. Yet, when was the last time you were in a room where nobody was on their phone? We can see rustlings of change, such as with the South Australian government's intention to create social bans for young people. The problem with this, though, is if you also look through history, you'll find that censorship usually creates just as many, if not more, problems than it resolves. So they may have missed the mark, but hopefully and possibly this is a marker of other, more helpful and flexible future changes. The systematic proliferation of education and a lot of persistence and a lot of patience is usually what paves the way for change. You can see this in the data about smoking cigarettes today, for example, where if you compare the rates today compared to a few decades ago, the data speaks for itself. So perhaps we're starting to come to terms with the impacts of our obsession with tech and convenience. There is already an alarming amount of forewarning about this through thought leaders across many disciplines, including every single person I'm going to mention today and countless others. Excuse my shoes. However, it will take time for society as a whole to accept the ramifications of device dependency and to hopefully become incentivized to do something about it, much like the eventual action to curb the obesity epidemic. Unfortunately, we do have some sobering truths to take into account though. While obesity may be starting to plateau in some parts of the world, and potentially worldwide, depending on where you get your stats from, obesity is still on the rise in many developing countries, and the rates and impacts globally are still tremendous. So what could the long-term repercussions on our mental health be if we don't start to loosen our grasp on this pursuit of intellectual and technological developments soon? I don't know the answer to this, obviously, but I think it's important that we start to ask questions like this, because questions, curiosity, and discourse are usually where change originates. Now, to further clarify, more than the obsession with tech itself, I believe that the true culprit actually originates in the culture that drives the technology dependency. Our fixation with optimizing, with hacking, with streamlining and manufacturing every part of our lives leaves very little room for our humanity. How can somebody make space for the throes of moving through an identity crisis when we're supposed to be productive every waking moment, and when we're encouraged to measure our worth according to our output? How do we remember to stop swiping and double tapping our presence away just to allow ourselves to feel something? So this measuring of human life might be helpful for something like a performance review at work. That's where it's appropriate. But it has somehow bled into every other aspect of our lives. We now feel guilty if we rest. We feel guilty if we give time to ourselves. We get guilty if we're tired. We get guilty if we don't show up looking like $1 million all the time. This is unrealistic to expect of any human being, and it does in very much echo the expectations that we place upon our technology, because tech can and should behave more or less the same way all the time, because it's designed that way. But we're not machines, and no matter how inconvenient this truth may be, ignoring this is costing us dearly. Everything in life has a cost. Whenever we say yes to something, we by necessity are saying no to something else, because neither our time nor our resources are infinite. Our potential is, but our output is not. The danger with obsessive optimization is that we may blindingly plow on with squeezing in another thing and another thing and another thing, but where is the cost? If you cannot see it in what's happening in front of you, then you have to look internally for the answer, because no exchange is free. This brings me to the hair I've had up my nose about how the coaching industry has somewhat missed an opportunity to create measures to guide an exploration in this space. There are endless metrics and measures on how to track progress in our external world. SMART goals, the wheel of life, endless types of performance reviews, and so on and so forth. There is now an emerging branch of coaching that is interested more in somatic healing, nervous system regulation, managing burnouts, things that move more into the counseling therapy space, which I think is fantastic. But we need a comprehensive methodology to help us systematically integrate these practices into our busy and chaotic lives. When we get that promotion, or we get that desirable partner, or we buy the house, the whole world notices immediately, and the whole world claps. If only it were like that when we take care of ourselves. Now, to be completely fair, there is something of a shift beginning in this space. Many people are up in arms saying, we need to take care of ourselves, we need to do something about this, but unfortunately, you should love yourself and take care of yourself simply doesn't cut it as a strategy, because it doesn't provide any specific guidance on the how. So, let's explore where coaching is with all of this. That's right, why did Susie sit down? So, this is the Wheel of Life. It was invented in 1960 by Paul J. Meyer. It's a fantastic metric that has been central to the coaching industry since its invention. I have used it. Anyone who's worked with me would have seen it in some shape or form. Pretty much every coach that I know utilizes some variation of it. However, the world is much more complicated now than it was in the 60s, and we need something that can account for these changes. Everything that it measures is still relevant. You probably would look at all those areas and go, yes, I can attribute where my life sits with all of these. But we need more. It doesn't capture the full context of a human experience, and it didn't then either, but it's more prominent now. And if we focus solely on the external, which this by and large does, there's also this danger of falling into the toxic hustle culture trap, because what we focus on is where we go. It's what grows. So once upon a time, it was probably easier for our internal needs to be met simply because of how the world worked. We were not constantly assaulted by screens and stimulation. The cost of living was far more manageable, and it was easier to find idle moments and quiet space with our thoughts simply by default. And so possibly such things had more of a chance to just come along for the ride. Those days are gone. Properly, well and truly. We now require strategies to proactively protect ourselves from the onslaught of modern life. A few years ago, when I was properly getting really concerned about the toxic hustle culture stuff that was going on at the time, I stumbled across this. The fantastic work of Dr. Saundra Dalton Smith, who invented the 7 types of rest. Again, anyone who's worked with me would be familiar with this. This is a comprehensive model of rest that assists with the prevention and recovery from burnout and overwhelm. These areas all give back to an individual and can be easily neglected if we over-focus on the more material pursuits that form the foundation of modern Western capitalism. I feel that it is accepted that burnout is a global issue that requires addressing, but it still feels like something that gets kind of managed as an afterthought. Once someone is like properly on the way to getting sick, that's when we're going to start talking about it, because before that, they'll be all right. We can just keep going, and there's not much of an encouragement for a proactive and preventative approach. The 7 types of rest acknowledge that we cannot draw from an empty well, and I adopted it and started utilizing it in the same way as the wheel. I used it as the other side of the same coin. This worked to create a sense of balance to an extent, but it is still a little bit clunky. Something rest, physical rest, mental rest, emotional rest, etc. There's a connotation there that can sometimes backfire in an achievement-driven world. The word rest implies that you are ceasing something, and language is powerful. This connotation could be rejected in the mind of someone who interprets stopping as ceasing doing something valuable. It is true that you're not always necessarily doing something productive when you rest, but you are still very much doing something constructive when you give back to yourself. I could still feel some resistance with a few clients using the 7 types of rest model, so I wanted to reframe it into an affirming way that encouraged those utilizing this map to view giving back to themselves as something constructive and therefore as something worth doing. I did some Googling and I couldn't find anything that did this yet. And look, I'm going to put my hand up here. I'm not the entire world and universe. There's probably something out there, but I couldn't find it. And so I did this. It looks a bit scary, but it's going to stay there for the rest of the while. So don't worry if you want to come and have a look at it later or whatever. So it's big. I shifted the perspective to a mapping task of the external world and the internal world, which kind of captures the 7 types of rest. But then I added a few more metrics that kept coming up in conversations that the existing models weren't really accounting for. Yes, guys, we're going to look at those next week. So here's where it gets interesting. To move forward, so to get any of these areas to grow in your external world wheel, you go out into the world, you expend energy and bandwidth, and you trade that in to obtain tangible resources. To progress in the internal world model, you conversely come back to yourself. You put down tangible resources and you trade them in and you get back energy and bandwidth. Here we have balance. And this allows us to think of giving back to ourselves in terms of an equation and in terms of exchangeable currencies, which mimic the way that we're encouraged to think nowadays. So, like in the Wheel of Life, these are self-ratings out of 10. Unlike some of the models of the Wheel of Life, I'm not going to give you questions that you answer yes to. I'm not going to pretend that I know your definition of success. So instead what I do is that, get a person to have a think about what each of these areas means to them I accidentally overlapped that. That's meant to say boundaries with self, but boundaries with self works. Get them to have a think about what that means for them, and then get themselves to rate themselves accordingly. So, there are 12 segments in each wheel, and my recommendations are to choose no more than 4 in each wheel, but ideally only 2 or 3 for each quarter. Because again, resources, time, none of this is infinite. Focusing on everything equals focusing on this many. So, the juxtaposition of the 2 wheels can help us notice if we're loading too heavily into one wheel, usually going to be that one, and there are quadrants here as well. These can help us notice other further imbalances, such as, again, the most likely one, if we happen to be over-focusing on material resources compared to the rest of the wheel. Obviously, those are grand generalizations, but we do live in a materialistic world. I'm not going to pretend that that's not a thing. So, you don't have to choose one area in every quadrant every time, but it can be valuable whenever you reassess to try to look back over past results and go, am I always choosing in the same quadrants? Because if you are, get curious. So, work-life balance never made my shoes. They are very squeaky, I apologize. Work-life balance never made much sense to me as a construct. First of all, it implies that work is just as important as the whole rest of your life, which is a very, very dangerous way to look at things. But it's also just a vague label. It provides very little guidance on how you're supposed to pursue it. Balance between our internal and our external worlds within a model like this, however, feels symbiotic. It can help us pinpoint our wins, challenges, and be more specific about it while honoring the human experience more completely. In order to make sense of anything that a client brings to me, I always want to hear about the context in which it is occurring, and this allows us to map it out because all human experience is contextual. I'm going to take a moment to take a big sip from my unicorn because this is an obnoxious moment.
That's okay.
Kermit the Frog is present. I just wanted to show off my cup. It's very, very cute. So, our internal world and our external world need to be looked at together. Our minds and our bodies need to be looked at together. Our relationship to ourselves and our relationship to other people needs to be looked at together. Our professional lives and our personal lives need to be looked at together. To completely ignore any facet of the human experience in order to try and get one specific outcome is short-sighted because it fails to take into account the context that can and will impact the potential outcome. Sometimes what can make or break a strategy is something that's sitting way over there in the periphery of our attention. And sometimes pursuing a goal at all costs can make another facet of our lives completely disintegrate if we become excessively tunnel-visioned. So consequently, when I work with somebody, I like to take a really big step back, which I'm not going to demonstrate because I don't want to die, and get to know who they are as a whole, because that can help them get to know themselves more as well. They might have been ignoring or suppressing a part of themselves for some time. They might be a part of themselves that they'd forgotten was there or that they'd stopped celebrating the existence of. There might be a part of themselves that is changing, or there might be a part that's emerging and is relatively new and they're not even aware of it yet. At any given moment in our life, we are a product of our past and even more so of how we interpret and narrate the significance of those events back to ourselves. So if we don't look back from time to time, we miss valuable information. But if we get stuck back there, that can also have a detrimental impact on our capacity to move forward. So this is one of the reasons that I like to explore an individual's story together with these different facets of their life when we first start working together. Someone might be like, no, I just want to focus on my career, nothing else. And sometimes we will remain somewhat more streamlined moving forward. But even when we do, I will still complete something like this. Because at very least then, it allows me to ask, what are the ramifications of the desired actions to the other areas of a person's life? And vice versa. Because nothing occurs in a vacuum. So, this model does still very much allow for and encourage the pursuit of goals, but it also makes us face where we might be tempted to neglect our own humanity. Ultimately, no matter how efficient we become, we are mortal mammals who are wired for connection above all. We live in an immense and chaotic universe that will always have the capacity to throw an element of entropy into our neat little plans, and we would do well to remember that. Reflecting on how small we are in the vastness of the universe can feel frightening. I'm not wrapping up, this is just an epic moment. But it is also liberating. It renders us free to explore. When we accept our place in all of this, there's not really much left to prove anymore. We give less of our energy to, I'll show them, and we can zoom out. But to what though? What matters once we abandon a super rigid identity to fight for? I would like to offer a few different perspectives that might be helpful to reflect upon. Story time. A fantastic question that I came across is from one of my books, which some of you will be familiar with, Hell Yeah or No by Derek Sivers. I would like to read you the first page from this book because it's quite a heavy hitter for what is honestly really quite a small book. And I quote, "You know that feeling that you have after a big meal when you're so full, sorry guys who are competing, that you don't want anything more? Ever wonder what that would feel like in the other areas of your life? We do so much for the attention, to feel important or praised, but what if you had so much attention and so much praise that you couldn't possibly want more? What would you do? Rewind. What would you do then? What would you stop doing? We do so many things for the money, whether we need it or not. But what if you had so much money that you couldn't possibly want more? What would you do then? What would you stop doing? And then, if you stopped doing all these things that you're doing just for the money or the attention, what would be left? Who would you be if you didn't do these things? If you were completely satiated, then what? After an understandable period of relaxing, what would you pursue? Don't say sit around and do nothing because that's just still relaxing. I mean after that, when you're ready to be useful to others again, what would you do then if you didn't need the money and you didn't need the attention?" End quote. Get the book, it's really good. Wise words from a fantastic thought leader. And yes, standing here right now and all the attention stuff, the irony isn't lost upon me. It's noted. So, another perspective is Bronnie Ware's observational research from her time working as a palliative carer. Over many years, she collected data, and published a book about the regrets that were most frequently said to her from people who knew that they were living out their final days. There were no regrets about wishing for another promotion, for more convenience, for more efficiency, or for more wealth. They were all about connection to the self and to others. Here's what they were. I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. I wish I'd stayed in touch with my friends. And I wish I'd let myself be happier. If you knew that you only had 12 months left to live, would any of these be hanging over you right now? And if the answer is yes, what could you do about it today? These regrets point to our intrinsic need to belong, which brings me to the cryptic quote by Maya Angelou, and I quote, "You are only free when you realize you belong no place. You belong every place. No place at all." End quote. I heard a fantastic talk by Brené Brown where she provides an insightful elaboration on this quote. Belonging is about being a part of something, but it is also about having the courage to stand alone when it is necessary. This doesn't really provide us with a satisfying checklist definition of identity. But if you know and you feel that you are present within yourself, and you give love to yourself, and you know and you trust that you will stand by your own side, even when nobody else will, can identity ever really be anything more meaningful than that? In this light, identity becomes more something that we intuitively feel and know, rather than something that we might be able to describe intellectually with ease to another person. So, what is intuition then? Many would describe this as our gut instincts. But in a world with so much noise, how do we find it? How do we know that that is what we're actually tapping into? And what could be interfering with this in the first place? I've been asked more than once by my clients, how do I know if I'm responding to my intuition or to my learned impulses? Both feel largely automatic, and they kind of just unfold in front of us. But they're not the same thing. Impulses develop through conditioned fears and pain, whereas intuition originates from peace, clarity, and from being in a flow state. Neither require much cognitive deliberation, but if I had to point out the observable difference between these, it would be this. Intuitive ideas allow for space and for choice. We can simply let intuitive thoughts move through us and into action, but we could also choose to press pause and observe them instead, and doing so would likely feel relatively harmonious. Conversely, impulse feels compulsive because it is fear-driven. Intense sensations of discomfort and even panic can arise when we attempt to press pause on the actions that are being driven by this. In his most recent book about mental and emotional well-being, The Way Forward, poet and meditator Young Pueblo writes, and I quote, "Trauma reacts, intention responds. The intensity of your reaction reveals how much of your past you're holding on to." End quote. Viewed from this lens, if we find ourselves in a heightened state, if we're triggered, if we can feel that we're moving into the peak of an intense emotion, then taking action in that moment without much further thought will likely be driven by impulse, not by intuition. Intuition beams through from a place of peace and calmness, which we will not be able to access when our limbic system is firing on all cylinders. Intuition, therefore, speaks to nervous system regulation and to emotion regulation. Importantly, emotion regulation does not mean that you're going to be happy all the time. Some areas of the coaching industry have a lot to answer for the perpetuating this whole good vibes only nonsense. This is toxic positivity, which has only further contributed to the problematic avoidance that society has developed towards negative emotions. Seeking to be happy all the time is not practical, nor is it healthy. Unfavorable things will happen from time to time, and aiming to be calm and perhaps, seeking to be hopeful and to have optimism in those difficult moments can be an adaptive goal. But aiming to have happiness in those moments simply doesn't make any sense at all. And it sets a person up to either just outright fail or to internalize and reject their their negative emotions, which will only find other often messier ways to come out. Emotion regulation is not about feeling neutral all the time either. You will still experience the full spectrum of emotions, but it means that you will know how to handle yourself along the way. Yeah. All emotions are healthy to have access to and to be able to sit with and feel their depth and their richness, because emotions are signals and they contain valuable information. However, when they remain at full force for long periods of time, they can become intolerable. Regulation is what occurs on the other side of experiencing an emotion peaking, soothing yourself, and guiding yourself through that wave. Now, an important distinction, the regulation quadrant here is specifically categorizing some of the most reliable nervous system regulation techniques, which is a subset of emotion regulation. Leaning into any of the 12 in the internal world can have a positive impact on emotion regulation. Not necessarily, but it can. So, there are 4 known stress responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. If you've never heard about fawn before, go look it up. It's very important and it's valuable to know it, particularly if there's a little bit of people pleasing. This is the least known one, and honestly, we all need to know what it is. But anyway, I digress. When any of these 4 stress responses are activated, it becomes extremely challenging to prevent acting from fear-driven impulse. My recommendation is to practice nurturing your internal world proactively because whatever you make a habit of in the good times will be more accessible to you when things get tough and when the tunnel vision of the stress response kicks in. As the Greek philosopher Archilochus, I don't think I'm saying it right, and as I'm also frequently reminded of by my Red, because he loves this quote too, and I quote, "We don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training." I see the bodybuilders nodding. End quote. It's a very, very good one. And it's helping me see where I am. That rehearsal will make it more likely for you to remember that you can turn to this nurturing when something goes wrong to try to regulate first, then respond, rather than to just act off impulse. Easier said than done. I do appreciate that. Yeah. Now, if we are chronically exhausted and if we are chronically externally focused, we will be at risk of chewing through all of our bandwidth. This keeps us stuck in one of the four, or maybe all of the four, stress responses, which renders us more prone to being swept away by conditioned fears and impulses. This is one of the reasons why turning to our friends on the floor as a soothing mechanism when we feel discomfort, why it is so dangerous, because phones don't actually soothe our emotions. Phones distract us from our emotions. So distraction in small and discrete amounts can actually be really, really helpful when you're going through a hard time. You stare at something difficult all day long, not a good time. But phones chronically distract us, which is less adaptive, because then we never get around to actually figuring out what that emotion was trying to tell us in the first place. Phones also overstimulate us, which is actually exhausting, not restorative. And then if we take that to the extreme, phones numb us, which throws us even further out of balance. In the TED Talk on the power of vulnerability that launched Brené Brown into fame, I love Brené Brown, she's another one to look out for, she spoke about how we live in an inherently vulnerable world because difficult times are inevitable and occur to everybody. What is really dangerous about not wanting the discomfort and inconvenience of unpleasant emotions is this, and I quote, and this is fabulous. I can say that because it's not something I wrote. You cannot selectively numb emotion. You can't say, here's the bad stuff, here's vulnerability, here's grief, here's shame, here's fear, here's disappointment. I don't want to feel these. You can't numb those hard feelings without numbing the other emotions. You cannot selectively numb. So when we numb those, we numb joy, we numb gratitude, we numb happiness. I skipped a bit. I am sorry. I'm going to start this again because it is important. I don't want to feel these. I'm going to have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. I didn't want to miss that part. I don't want to feel those. You can't numb those hard feelings without numbing the other emotions. You cannot selectively numb. So when we numb those, we numb joy, we numb gratitude, we numb happiness, and then we're miserable, and then we're looking for purpose and meaning, and then we feel vulnerable, and then we have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. And it becomes this dangerous cycle. One of the things that I think we need to think about is why and how we numb, and it doesn't have to just be addiction. The other thing that we do is that we make everything that's uncertain certain. Religion has gone from a belief in faith and mystery to certainty. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up, that's it, just certain. The more afraid we are, the more vulnerable we are, the more afraid we are. This is what politics looks like today. There's no discourse anymore. There's no conversation. There's just blame. You know how blame is described in the research? A way of discharging pain and discomfort. End quote. So this talk was given in 2010, but my goodness, has it aged well. Now, even more than back then, we have the capacity to numb ourselves at our fingertips all the time. And we're doing it to the point where it's birthing other societal concerns. Divided attention is quite the norm now. Fubbing is a term that needed to be introduced to label the phenomenon of being ignored by another present person in favour of a phone. But we're not only ignoring our loved ones with our devices, we're ignoring the most important relationship that you're ever going to be in, the relationship with yourself. Any relationship that we neglect suffers eventually. If every time that you were struggling or that you felt that you were in need, a friend just ignored you and got on their phone, how long would it take before you would start to wonder if they care about you at all? This is how we're treating ourselves every single day now. How can you know what your needs are and what your emotions want to be heard and the emotions that want to be healed if we're chronically ignoring ourselves and slathering ourselves in reels and likes and swipes and memes and scroll holes and all of that noise? Is it any wonder that we're now seeing data that there is a loneliness epidemic emerging? We're the most connected that we have ever been in terms of how to get in touch with someone, but so many people feel tremendously alone and disconnected all the same. So this is not an issue of creating more technological capacity or more hacks to be able to fit in more events and tasks and appointments and whatnot. This is about returning to ourselves. This is about remembering our origins. This is about honoring the animal within. This is about rebuilding our relationship with ourselves, of slowing down and remembering that a tiny but loving village is more meaningful than an ocean of fans and likes. Life is there to be lived, and emotions are there to be felt. We are here to exist and to have the greatest adventure of living, something that even with all that tech, we still have come no closer to explaining how that initial spark began. So let us sit back in awe at how remarkable that is, and how remarkable we are, how lucky we are to be here, even though some days can be so incredibly difficult. We are this big in this tremendous universe, and this all ends. So remember that all of the signals point to us being here for connection, to ourselves, to each other, and to this beautiful world that we live in. Let that guide your decisions, and remember to put the phone down from time to time. Thank you.